Hello and welcome to the NDTV Dialogues, a conversation of ideas. And who better to discuss ideas with than Fareed Zakaria. He's our guest tonight, one of the world's leading foreign policy commentators and CNN host who has just written a new book, Age of Revolutions. Fareed, thanks so much for being on the NDTV Dialogues.
Pleasure to be here. Pleasure to be here.
Let me come to your book specifically, which talks of a multitude of revolutions past and present. One of the key ones is geopolitics. What do you see as India's role in the changing world order, especially as you just said, we talk about the rise of the West versus the United States. And interestingly, this time in the elections, according to election surveys, foreign policy, the Modi government's foreign policy has also been a key factor for voters when they're deciding what to vote for.
Yeah, let's not forget that it was a very important factor in the last election. In fact, I would argue, basically, if you look at this election, the first time Prime Minister Modi was elected and the BJP got a majority, it was essentially an election about change, which is fairly familiar in India. You know, there's always been a tendency to want rotation of government, very healthy in my view in a democracy. The second election was largely focused on a kind of anti-Pakistan Indian nationalist wave, obviously caused by Pakistani actions, but which Prime Minister Modi was able to use and ride to victory. This one, I have to say, it's not entirely clear, but doesn't feel to me, looking from the outside, as much of a wave election. It doesn't feel as much that there are strong engines. It seems that there are different forces moving in different directions. And you're right, one of the factors people are looking at is foreign policy. Now, when you look at the geopolitical revolution that I talk about in my book, as I say, the rise of China, the return of Russia, these have become the crucial new features of the world order, and both of them present a kind of frontal challenge to the existing rules-based international order. India becomes very important in that context because India can provide a kind of ballast, counterweight to China. It's the only country of the size and scale that has the capacity to do that in the long run in Asia. It also has the capacity to provide a kind of counterweight in terms of upholding a rules-based international order, which India has always historically been in favor of. You know, emphasis on state sovereignty, emphasis on adjudicating things through bodies like the UN. So there is a very positive and constructive role India can play in this new world. There is a market, if you will, for India out there. There's tremendous goodwill in the United States and in Europe for India. The challenge for India is twofold. One, it has to grow economically. You know, India is still more a story of potential than of realized potential. China is still 5 times larger than India in economic terms. In terms of per capita GDP, of course, India is still a poor country. It's $2,700 per capita, which makes it the poorest country in the G20. So to wield its weight, it will have to continue to move economically and, frankly, a bit faster. I mean, a poor country like India needs to move at 9%. And the second piece is India needs to remain committed to a rules-based international order. There's always a danger that a country like India will seek a narrow and short-term temporary advantage and forsake some of those rules. And I think in general, India is better off. India has the potential to be a rule maker rather than a rule taker in the new world order. It can shape the agenda. It can make the rules. But in order to do that, it has to live by them.
One interesting aspect of this is really when we look at the Prime Minister's approval ratings and compared to global leaders, he consistently tops that. His latest approval ratings are higher than any other global leaders. And if election results, of course, on the 4th of June, but if the Prime Minister is re-elected, it will be a historic third term, beating Prime Minister Nehru's record. Will the fact that Prime Minister Modi has a mandate with this, which is, of course, of the world's largest democracy, if he gets that mandate again, does it give him a democratic legitimacy that many other world leaders, say when you talked about the China comparison, lack?
It certainly will give him a much greater legitimacy in the Western world. because he will, in a sense, be representing legitimately, credibly, a country of 1.4 billion people. And that does provide a certain kind of both moral and political ammunition for Prime Minister Modi. Will it matter to Xi Jinping and to Putin and to people like that? Not really. I mean, their view is you deal with the government that is in place. How it got there is nobody outside's concern. And, the world does continue to live by those rules, but I don't think that they would particularly care one way or the other. It certainly does give Prime Minister Modi greater political stability and capital. But the real question is, what will Prime Minister Modi do with this third term? Let's assume he gets it. This is the great challenge he faces. What does he want his legacy for India to be? India internally, India within the, in the broader world. And I think that's a great opportunity for Prime Minister Modi for precisely the reason you say. It's historic, and he is very popular. A lot of the country listens to him. And so he can either appeal to what Lincoln called the better angels of Indians and try to bring the country together and move it forward so that everyone prospers and everyone feels included. Or, there are other paths. So that is, to me, the great challenge is how will Prime Minister Modi view this potentially historic legacy-forming third term?
Mm-hmm. Part of, say, perhaps India's foreign policy under the Modi government, and I think the foreign minister expressed this extensively on many occasions, but I think really the breaking point with what India and the West went in different directions was, of course, over Ukraine and the whole India's relationship with Russia, the import of Russian oil. We've seen that the world, in a sense, came around to India's position on this. Even the Ukraine foreign minister who I interviewed recently in India said that we accept India's argument now because, they're importing it in rupees. In fact, European countries then bought it once it had been processed in India. So in that sense, what have you seen as an observer of the Modi government's foreign policy? What do you think have been its major successes? Also the fact that Yuval Harari, when he talked to me after the attack last year in October, made the point that India can speak to countries like Iran. We need countries like India which can speak to all the major players in this new geopolitical turbulence more than ever before. Do you agree with that view?
I do. I've always felt that it doesn't make any sense to isolate countries completely. I've been in favor of the United States talking to Iran. I've been in favor of the United States having negotiations with Russia. And the United States never objected to India buying Russian oil or buying Russian weapons. The United States has been very understanding of India's strategic concerns and realities. I think my own view is India needs to ask itself, does it really want to get 80 to 90% of its advanced weaponry from a country like Russia, which is a power in deep technological decline, in economic crisis, and that has been politically isolated by 65% of global GDP. That's an Indian choice, but the Americans have not in any way sanctioned India for those reasons. They have been very understanding. The issue is, again, not that India has this capacity and goodwill about it, but what does it do with it? So, for example, you point out it does have relations with Iran, which could be very useful. Mm-hmm. But has it used that capacity for anything above its narrow self-interest of simply importing oil from Iran? Has it used it to try to create a more stable, peaceful atmosphere in the Middle East? Has it tried to broker some kind of, negotiations or anything that could bring the temperature down? Now, the Chinese have played that role. I wonder, why shouldn't India play that role? India would be, I think, better suited to do it because Western powers would trust India more than they trust China by a long shot. India could become a genuine intermediary. So I keep looking for India to use its position in a productive and constructive way that is in line with its interests, it's in line with its values, and that will then...
We have done that in Russia and Ukraine, where the Prime Minister spoke to both the President Putin and the President Zelensky, and made the point to Russia that this is not a time for war. And of course, the G20 declaration, where we got everyone to actually sign on that dotted line.
The G20 was an important achievement. I absolutely agree. I think nothing has been done to build on it. I think it really is time for us to get into negotiations with the Russians and Ukrainians, because, this is a war that is helping nobody. It is killing tens of thousands of Russians and Ukrainians. Russia has been largely isolated, particularly, as I say, from the most advanced sectors of the world economy. The Ukrainian people are suffering massive, massive hardship. So why not speed up that process? Why not try to offer a place, a platform, things like that? The G20 was a long time ago. The war has not. Let's be honest. While that was a good symbolic effort, nothing has changed. The war continues. In fact, it's getting worse.
India has been making this plea very vociferously that really organizations like the UN Security Council, are now outdated, that the global organizations need to be more representative of the world. The African Union needs to be part, and India needs to be in the UN Security Council. Do you think that time is long overdue? And do you think that that really is the next big geopolitical move that we may see happening strategically for countries like India? And with China constantly having a veto power, how actually are we going to negotiate this?
Yeah, I mean, you raised the question exactly right. It's important that India be included. It's long overdue, but because of China, it will never happen. The Chinese have a veto in the Security Council, and there's no way to get it through the Security Council without without China's approval. So my suspicion is what happens to these groups, because it's not just India. There are no African countries on the UN Security Council. I mean, the UN Security Council, in a sense, reflects the power dynamic in 1945 at the end of World War II. We're a long way from that. But my guess is what happens is these organizations, they don't become irrelevant. I mean, there will always be a relevance, but they become less relevant. And what you will have is the G20 will gain relevance, will become more important. That's why I do applaud Prime Minister Modi taking the G20 as seriously as he did, because I suspect that becomes the new forum in which policies are coordinated, and now they won't have the same legitimacy that the UN does, because the UN has a history, and it does, at the General Assembly level, it does include all nations, and there is a kind of, in its own way, a democratic legitimacy about that in the General Assembly there's one nation, one vote. But I suspect that there will be many different forums in the world going forward, and India will have to play in all of them. But it will have to choose the ones where its influence and its weight can be appropriately, used. And I suspect the G20 becomes a very critical forum for India, where the UN Security Council will not be.
And of course, Prime Minister Modi has said he will attend. And of course, this is, I suppose, part of the confidence he's portraying, that he will attend the G7 at the end of June as well. But just to ask on that particular point, we had a prominent Indian American business delegation recently, and they, in an interview, they told me that, we always looked at India as a political risk country and the US as a politically stable country. And they said the tables are now exactly turned. It's a completely reverse situation where we see India as politically stable and it's the US which is political risk. What's your take on that?
Well, the market doesn't agree with them. If you look at the stock market global capitalization, the U.S. is at an all-time high. The United States represents over 70% of the total stock market capitalization of the world. And 7 companies in the U.S., the 7 big technology companies, have a market capitalization that is larger than the total country market capitalization of Germany, France, Britain, and Canada put together. Apple alone has a market capitalization larger than that of all of Germany. So when you look at it in those terms, the market certainly thinks that the U.S. is by far the most important economy in the world, the only one in which there is genuine innovation, technological breakthroughs taking place. So, I mean, yes, the United States, look, fears about the U.S. can be overdone. The U.S. is going through a very complicated, polarized, angry political debate. Sometimes all of this goes to court. But notice, it is all resolved in court. Donald Trump appealed, against the last election, I think in 55 different courts. He got 55 rulings against him, including from a majority of judges who were Republican appointed. including a large number who were Trump appointed, and he abided by that decision. Does that speak to political instability, or does it speak to political stability? That you have a country where people can go at each other, they can, they can try their best to win, they take everything to court, which is their legal right, but when the court rules, and it is genuinely independent, they abide by the rulings. To my mind, that's a sign of political stability.
I want to take that point because, of course, technology is also one of the four present revolutions you mentioned in your book. Now, India has taken a very different route from the US, where exactly as you said, that the top technology companies actually rival the GDP of many major economies in the world. In India, the digital highways, the digital revolution is seen as public infrastructure. It's cheap data available to all, and that's really our digital public infrastructure is now a model we're using geopolitically, in a sense, to actually export to the world as a model that is effective, which is for the people and not just owned by a few technology companies which make huge profits. Do you think India's DPI is actually the way that India has gone with technology is the way ahead for many countries as well?
Well, I talk about this a lot in the book. I have a whole chapter on the technological revolution. And it's not just one revolution, by the way. There are now two revolutions taking place. One is in information technology, one is in biotechnology, and India is involved in a way in both of them. I think India has taken a very wise path with Aadhaar and the entire digital stack that India has, the platform. It's enormously useful to have it be a publicly owned one. Whether it's the better path than America, I think is irrelevant in a way, because the U.S. invented the digital world and the internet and things like that. And so perhaps it had to, in order to exploit it, it had to move in the direction it did. And it's more in the character of the American system that these things be privately owned. I mean, oil companies in America.
So the corporatization of technology, perhaps, versus the public aspect of it.
It's always been true. I mean, energy in America is run by the private sector, right? Now you can look at it and say it's bad that it's done by the private sector, or on the other hand, as a result of that, because of technological innovations, America is now the world's leading producer of energy. America produces more oil than Saudi Arabia. It produces more natural gas than Qatar. So that happens because of private sector energy and investment. So there's an upside and a downside. But my point is that India, as a poor country and as a late arriver in technology, chose the best path it could have taken. The key now is for that infrastructure to be used not just to provide subsidies to ordinary Indians and farmers and things like that, which is all good. It's wonderful stuff, and I'm so glad it's being done so much more efficiently than it has ever been done before, with much less of the people taking their puglis along the way. But it should also be used to create great Indian technology companies. That is one of the it was something I spend a little bit of time on my own trying to encourage, a U.S.-India tech corridor, so that India can move up the technological value chain using Aadhaar, using these platforms. So far, what you have seen is less of that than I think would be ideal. And one of the things I'm trying to do is spur more creative thinking about how India moves up the value chain.
Interestingly, also in the book, you've talked about the backlash, because of course the book is about progress and backlash from the 1600s to the present in the age of revolutions. How to beat the backlash that threatens the liberal revolution? You've called it the crisis of global liberalism. Now in India, of course, is also often a battle about the so-called left liberals versus a more right-wing worldview and right-wing supporters. Why do you think there is such a backlash globally against liberalism?
Because there's been so much forward movement and so much change that it leaves people very disoriented. And in that process, there has developed a kind of urban elite that has gained enormous power all over the world. So you think about India over the last 20 or 30 years, you have, without any question, a kind of much greater emphasis on knowledge economy, knowledge workers. If you think about the technocrats who run various parts of India economically, even socially, So, there is a reality to the fact that power has been concentrated in the metro centers, in the big cities, and that the people outside, the people maybe who don't go to college and who are not as educated and don't speak English in India or even aspire to speak English, they feel left out. And everywhere you see, there is a certain kind of backlash. And the person who can capture that backlash often has a lot of energy on his side. If you look at all the elections in Latin America, whether it's, sometimes it's from the left and sometimes it's from the right, but they're always attacking the establishment. Prime Minister Modi is almost unique in the world in that he has been able to both be an insider and an outsider. He can appeal to the Aam Aadmi, and at the same time, of course, he is prime minister. Trump has a little bit of that same technique, where he's able to appeal to both, though of course he's much less popular because in America there's a much larger urban population, a much larger group of people who feel like Trump is not their guy. But Prime Minister Modi has been able to both appeal to the common man and at the same time be part of the technocratic, technological-based wave of modernization that is happening in India, which is why I think he's been so politically successful.
You've described this thing, you've written in columns about the genius of Prime Minister Modi. What exactly did you mean by that?
Well, it's precisely this. Modi has, he's politically very savvy. If you look at the first iteration of Hindutva, when Advani and Vajpayee, it was more of a kind of upper caste or mid caste phenomenon, which is ultimately why it came undone, was that the Dalits and Muslims, of course, in large parts of the kind of mid and lower caste Hindus never fully embraced it. Prime Minister Modi understood that and made both strategic alliances with Dalit parties, but also an appeal to people. He can see, for example, that there's weakness of this Hindutva in the South. So he makes a particular effort strategically to reach out in the South. So he's very aware of how do you put together a large governing coalition. And that, I think he is extraordinarily skilled politically.
So 2024 is a key year for elections globally. I think almost half the world's population is voting this year. Now, I don't know if you're a betting man, but we are a week away from results in India's general elections. Who do you see as winning, Prime Minister Modi or the opposition, which could be Rahul Gandhi, which could be Arvind Kejriwal, or whoever the leader of the India alliance is? They say they sort that out. But who do you see as winning India's general election?
Oh, it would be foolish of me, it's thousands of miles away to make a prediction. I will tell you that I found that, I've traveled a lot in the world during elections, and not being there, it's very hard to tell because there's always something that you get from the ground, from an actual experience of being there. From the outside, as I said, the most noticeable thing is that there were real waves in the last two elections. Wave of change in the first one, wave of anti-Pakistani, pro kind of Indian nationalism in the second one. I don't get the sense. This one is a little more complicated.
Do you think one of the interesting aspects, and this is really seems to have happened in the last 10 years, is the dehyphenation? You made that point at Pakistan and how it was a key factor in the last election, that how Pakistan has been completely dehyphenated from India. We don't talk about it in Indian politics really anymore, except for some, Twitter comments, etc., or some campaign speech. But it's not really a key issue anymore in the world. Doesn't really link. I mean, Pakistan has been completely dehyphenated from India. Do you see that as a success of India's foreign policy, or just a fallout of Pakistan's collapse in a sense?
Yeah, I think it's more a fallout of Pakistan's collapse. Look, the reason that was happening even earlier was because of Islamic terrorism, because of, the Al-Qaeda and ISIS and the degree to which, don't forget, Pakistan was the home of Al-Qaeda. This is something we now know definitively, and that when President Hamid Karzai of Afghanistan used to say, I can tell you for sure that bin Laden and all those people and Mullah Omar are in Pakistan. We now know that, in fact, that was all true. So Pakistan was a hotbed of something that was roiling the whole world. So that has gone away to a large extent. That threat has diminished. And India has risen to a point where the difference between India and Pakistan has grown. So it certainly is part of that. But I think mostly we have to thank Pakistani mismanagement for this.
And you're not betting on India's result, but what do you see on the Trump-Biden face-off? Who do you see as the winner of that November election?
Again, it's too, honestly, at this point, it's a little early to say, but only because, look, there are two things you can say for sure. Biden will win the national vote by millions of votes. He won it last time by, I think, 8 million votes. He'll win it probably by even more this time. But the way the American system is set up, and it's unique in the democratic world, that doesn't matter. What matters is these electoral college votes, which are based on a few states. And there, in those states, it's essentially a statistical tie. So, you're talking about in a country of 340 million people, probably 200,000 to 300,000 votes will make a difference one way or the other. So how to, figure that out? If you were to vote today, it looks very good for Trump. If the vote were held today, it looks good for Trump. Given how narrow the margins are, a lot can happen between now and November.
Right. Fareed Zakaria, thank you so much for being on the NDTV Dialogues. It's been great talking to you. Thank you.
My pleasure, Sonia. Thanks for having me.